right, and welcome to the January 11th edition of Going Viral at GoingViral.news. My name is Jim Dingeman. We're joined with Michael Jankowitz, Dennis Goldstein, Alex Stavropoulos on the West Coast, Ken Aaron. We're going to be joined with Gail Aronow later tonight, and I wanted to just start with the headlines before we get to the first piece. Now, today, the headlines in all the media was basically Joe Biden going down and arguing in Atlanta and also in Alabama, but mainly in Atlanta, about the need to have a voting rights bill passed. And we're going to talk about that in greater depth in a few minutes. He was warned by activists, and again, we're going to talk about that they didn't want a photo op visit. And we're going to, again, spend some time dealing with that in a minute or two. Throughout the United States, there's extreme cold. In the Northeast, it's closed schools and COVID testing sites. The environment is now officially, this year is the hottest ocean temperatures in history. They're recorded as the highest in history. Now, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, there was a fatal shooting of a black man by an off-duty officer, and it sparked protests throughout Fayetteville, North Carolina. Perhaps later we can spend more time. In Italy, there was a fascist display at a Rome funeral. There was a funeral for a individual who was a former militant of the right-wing group Forza Nuova, who died over the weekend, and they had actually a sort of fascist funeral for the guy. And so that caused a lot of problems in Italy politically and got condemned by the Pope's office itself. Russia sees no ground for optimism ahead of this NATO meeting that they're having. And so we're going to see more about that. And just to go through quickly the news on the Omicron and COVID-19 front, it turns out a new study says that the virus loses 90% of its ability to infect within 5 minutes in the air. Interesting. And also the World Health Organization predicts that 50% of Europeans in the next 2 months will be infected. Now, I should note that yesterday was the highest infection rate in the United States, period, of COVID in so far since the whole pandemic began in March of last year, of 2020. And in New Jersey, they've declared a state of emergency. So we're talking about some serious stuff going on with the COVID issue. And we're going to talk later about the death of Sidney Poitier. We have some pieces, and I know Michael Jankowitz wants to talk about that. And on Capitol Hill today, there was a clash between Rand Paul and Fauci. That's been going on for quite a long time. And there is also the issue that the WHO is raising about is the booster strategy a viable strategy? But the new cases in the United States are up 53% in the past week. The spiking numbers have gone way up, and this is also across the whole world. So we'll see what happens. And I believe one of my favorite tennis players, Mr. Djokovic, who's a notorious anti-vaxxer, was essentially, I think, given a pass to enter in Australia. So we'll find out more about that as time comes. But let me first start with the lead here and the whole issue of whether it's symbolic or whether something's actually going to happen. This is the NewsHour tonight talking at the lead about the whole issue of protecting the vote.
Jeff Bennett begins our coverage.
Full screen.
President Joe Biden today with an urgent new call to protect the right to vote.
To protect our democracy, I support changing the Senate rules.
The president throwing his full support behind a one-time change to the Senate filibuster to ease passage of voting rights legislation.
I believe that the threat to our democracy is so grave that we must find a way to pass these voting rights bills. Debate them, vote, let the majority prevail. And if that bare minimum is blocked, we have no option but to change the Senate rules, including getting rid of the filibuster for this.
But that requires the support of all 50 Democratic senators. And West Virginia's Joe Manchin and Arizona's Kyrsten Sinema aren't on board. And Republicans are nearly unanimous in opposing the bills as government overreach.
It's a power grab,
to enable a power grab.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says Democrats are promoting what he calls a fake outrage and fake hysteria on voting rights, ginned up by partisans.
If my colleague tries to break the Senate to silence those millions of Americans, we will make their voices heard in this chamber in ways that are more inconvenient for the majority and this White House than what anybody has seen in living memory.
The White House insists President Biden will work in lockstep with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who promised a vote on voting rights legislation as soon as tomorrow. Schumer warns that if Republicans filibuster the effort, he'll force another vote by Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Failure is not an option for the democracy of America.
President Biden's choice of Georgia for today's major voting rights speech is no accident. It served as the cradle of the civil rights movement and home to two of the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders, Dr. King, whom the president honored today, laying a wreath at his crypt and with a visit to King's pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and the late Congressman John Lewis, who represented the district where the president delivered his address. And the state is ground zero for the current challenge. After President Biden beat former President Trump in Georgia by less than 12,000 votes in 2020, the state became one of the first to pass more restrictive voting laws. Supporters point to one measure, an additional day of early voting, as the law increasing voter access. But other provisions take aim at mail-in voting, implement stricter voter ID requirements, and limit the use of ballot drop boxes. Georgia is now one of 19 states that have passed tougher voting laws since the 2020 election. Taken together, the president has said the laws are the biggest threat to democracy since the Civil War.
Each one of the members of the Senate is going to be judged by history on where they stood before the vote and where they stood after the vote. There's no escape. So let's get back to work.
And he says he's bracing for a bruising fight ahead to take action.
All right, so that's the liberal media talking about this today. And obviously, the problem with this is he's coming off of having his domestic agenda being completely derailed by Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. And in this issue, to get a sort of special filibuster rule to pass this, he also has to get it past the more centrist Democrats, but certainly Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and the Republicans, of course, have promised to blow it up. So I'm sort of curious to hear what others say. I think it's dead on arrival, unfortunately, but I can see the desire to press forward. But he got a lot of crap from Democrats locally who basically said, like, we're sick and tired of this posturing. What the hell are you doing? And so let me just play this. This is a little bit of CBS talking about this today. They were talking and following this story in a different way.
They will push the Senate to eliminate the filibuster in order to get legislation passed. But some Democrats say they want to see action before they hear another speech. Well, to discuss today's visit and the push for voting rights legislation, I want to bring in Bishop Reginald Jackson and Antoine Seawright. Bishop Jackson is a presiding prelate of the 6th Episcopal District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Georgia. And Antoine Seawright is CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Thank you both for spending some time with us today. Welcome, Bishop. I want to begin with you. What do you want to hear from the president today, and what exactly is at stake when you think about marginalized communities and Americans?
Well, first of all, we need to hear the president state emphatically and passionately his commitment to making sure that this federal legislation passes. All across the country, we've seen where states have passed voting legislation whose real intent is to suppress and make it harder for people of color to vote. The president needs to make it just as clear as he did last week that he is going to do all that he can to make sure that this federal legislation passes. In addition to that, it's imperative that this is not only a Democratic issue, but this is a national issue. So therefore, not only should every Democrat, but every Republican historically, voting has been a bipartisan issue, and it needs to be bipartisan now.
Antoine, I want to turn to you. A number of Georgia Democrats are joining the president and vice president today, but gubernatorial candidate and voting rights advocate Stacey Abrams said she couldn't make it. What does that tell you? Should we be looking into that?
We should not. And look, Jerika, before we talk about the who is going to show up today, I think we should talk about the what and the where. The fact that the president is going to visit Georgia, perhaps one of the most consequential states in the previous election, because it gave him the majority in the U.S. Senate when black voters in Georgia showed up in very handsome, untraditional fashion to give 2 U.S. senators. That gave the president the ability to pass what I believe to be a very progressive agenda in this country. So he's going to Georgia, the battleground for civil rights, and also think the battleground for voting rights. And so we talk about who shows up. Look, he's taken one of the most transformational black women in this country, the vice president of the United States, with him to Georgia. If I were advising Stacey Abrams' campaign, I would say to the candidate, look, there's tons of ground to cover in the state of Georgia. Let the president do his lifting in Atlanta, and let's spend our time elsewhere carrying the message of voting rights, infrastructure, and other quality of life issues that Georgians will have to deal with after the president and the vice president is gone. And the fact of the matter is, Stacey Abrams has her own campaign to run as a candidate for governor, not candidate for president of the United States or any other office other than the office she is seeking in Georgia.
Bishop, your church joined a lawsuit last year suing Governor Brian Kemp and the state of Georgia over its new election overhaul laws. What's the latest with the legal action, and why are you against the law?
We're against the law for several reasons. Number one, these laws only came about because of the big lie told by the former president, and in addition to that, because of the huge turnout of blacks in the 2020 election. The AME Church in Georgia, for example, we have what we call Operation Voter Turnout. Our goal was to get 75% of blacks to vote early, and they did. The black turnout was so great that now across the country, and especially here in Georgia, they say we've got to find a way to make sure this doesn't happen in 2022 and 2024. That's what these elections are about. And look at what they're doing. They're trying to do away with ballot drop boxes, trying to make it difficult to vote early by absentee voting. Then on top of that, even seniors. We had mobile voting booths, which traveled to senior centers to make it easier for seniors to vote. That is now against the law. Senator Mitch McConnell says if you read these bills, you'll find out that they're not bad. Well, the problem is we read the bills and we see how bad they can be. And our democracy is at risk. If we do not get this federal legislation, it will no longer be government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It will be where politicians will select their voters rather than the voters electing their leadership. SB 202 is horrible, and we need federal legislation to make sure those horrors do not persist.
All right. So this is happening all around the country. Politico, by the way, had a very interesting piece where they talked about how they discovered that there were actually 3 certified groups of electors with all the legal ballyhoo from the state of Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In other words, while there were actual electors to the Electoral College who were elected because Biden won narrowly in those states, there was an alternative group set up that had gone through all the legal paperwork. There were Republican state senators, et cetera, legislators from the state of Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin, who had sent to the Electoral College bogus certifications arguing that they were legitimate bodies from those states. In other words, the plot thickens with January 6th. And finally, just as an oddball curve, I listened today to a very sophisticated analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the Democratic Socialists of America and their surges in voting in different parts of the country, but particularly in New York State. And one of the points made was contrary to what Sanders argues when you have a big turnout. It turns out that when you have these local elections, it is better for the Democratic Socialists to have low turnout, because then they have a better chance to win in the primaries. And so they're able to, if the amount of people voting is about 1/10 to 120, let's say 10 to 20% of the local electorate, they can actually dominate the situation. They contrasted that with when Cynthia Nixon ran for the governor against Cuomo. When you have a big turnout, that's when you get clobbered by the more moderate Democrats. But anyway, the Voting Act issue is the most important thing to talk about today. And I'm sort of curious, Alex, let's start with you. What's your thoughts about what happened today with Biden making this announcement? And I should say that while I am cynical about the outcome, it's power to the people. People have to energize themselves, and there's always that possibility of people mobilizing and coming up against concrete walls, but there's always ways to topple those concrete walls. So I don't put people down for fighting to oppose these kind of restrictions being launched throughout the country. But anyway, Alex, your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, obviously they should lift the filibuster, not for just this specific case, but for all legislation. The filibuster is an anti-democratic procedural process that exists in no other country in the world, and it should be done away with. I mean, of course, I don't disagree with you, Jim, that it's probably not going to happen given, Sinema and Manchin. Not that I think Joe Biden really wants to get rid of the filibuster anyway. Again, my opinion has always been the filibuster is just as convenient for Democrats as Republicans, because Democrats have no more desire to do this kind of legislating to actually do anything, because in many cases it puts them up against the people who they really work for, their donors. They don't really work for the American people. They work for the people who donate money to them, and they probably feel they would lose all the elections if they chose to again, work for the voters, basically, that, all the money would go to the Republicans and they would never win another election. And, and of course, I also agree with you, Jim, about, the need for something outside of electoral politics on this too. I think the only way that, you would get change on the filibuster and voting rights and so on is, massive demonstrations, especially in the streets of Washington, that would put pressure on Democrats and Republicans to make these kinds of changes. But maybe, I think Mike probably has something to say too. So.
Yeah, go on, Mike. What do you think? Michael? You have to unmute, Mike.
Yeah, are you there, Mike? Okay.
Yeah, I was just trying to unmute. Well, first of all, I mean, it amazes me that in the year 2022 in the United States, we're talking about whether or not we should have about voting rights, about the basic right to vote, something that was a no-brainer 50 years ago. And it's obviously, excuse me. It's obviously a power grab. I mean, it's just a matter of the Republicans keeping power, which it's obvious, especially when they're talking about things like early voting, mail-in voting. I mean, it's not like they're not arguing that these aren't legitimate ways of voting. That, I mean, there is no argument that, in other words, people who vote early are still the people who are, who are allowed to vote. It's amazing. To me, it's just mind-boggling that there is this opposition to voting rights at this point. However, the United States is regressing into and is falling apart, as we've all discussed in earlier shows. The key thing where that a lot of people are missing, a lot of Democrats are missing, is that the Democrats really don't have a majority in the Senate. What they have is a tie that can be broken by the vice president. It is the narrowest margin you can have. And again, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, even if it was only one of them, that would be enough. So it's still an uphill battle for the Democrats. The thing that worries me is that if people don't see that, and don't see that fighting for a basic thing like voting rights is still an uphill battle in this country, and then they just become disillusioned with the Democrats and say, let the Republicans win next time, then we're sunk. Because to be quite honest, I agree with everybody that it doesn't look like this is going to go through, which is a shame and a stain on the United States. But it does. I mean, the only way something is going to go through is if the Democrats can increase their majority in the Senate and at least maintain or increase their majority in the House of Representatives. I have to correct myself. Not increase their majority in the Senate, but to actually get a majority in the Senate.
Right.
Right.
And that, of course, is jeopardized with what we are hearing with what's going to happen this year in the midterms. But let me bring Ken in. Ken, your comments about all this. Kenny? Got on mute, Ken.
Yeah, this is a hard body, the other people on this panel besides myself. You guys are all pushing for federal control of voting, not state control. You want to push for complete, everything goes down to the vote of the public, mass majority. Everybody votes. Are we having peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or fish fillet? And everybody votes, and then everybody has that decision. You want universal voting. You're pushing for it. You would eliminate, it sounds like you want to eliminate the Electoral College. You don't believe that this is a republic. You don't believe it's a collection of 50 different states where you can have different governance, where the power is distributed to the states, everything not owned by the federal government. So we do have federal laws that influence voting that came around in the Civil Rights Act. And and there's investigations every time that there's an abuse of eliminating people from the rolls or in any way inhibiting sectors of the population from voting. In fact, I think one of the major things we did on that was give women the right to vote because they weren't allowed before. Before that, you couldn't vote unless you owned land. So there's been progression in terms of who's included in the voting body, the electorate. You just want to make it Biden or, the current set of Democrats. And this is the silliest thing I've ever heard. We just want to make one exception for this one thing until the next thing comes along. But we want to make sure that we can get control and maintain control of the House and the Senate, or at least have a chance. We have to preserve everything that we can to give us a chance to maintain control. And then we can ask for another exception if we're 50-50 again. And it's to our advantage to have, let's say, universal income or health care for everybody, like Adams is doing in, Gavin Newsom wants to do in California. And Adams wants to do in New York City to let everybody vote, whether or not they're a citizen. So, radical ideas that even this group would agree. Well, some people might disagree with my viewpoint of having a wonderful utopian world where everybody gets along and nobody gets mad and we all love each other and everybody's responsible. So we don't need any laws or prisons. And, food grows on the trees. We don't have to worry about people starving or people having too many children that they can't support because the state's there and the state will take care of everything. So, you have those viewpoints. I thought Joe Biden was really making progress. I've noticed on my own observation that he's doing very much better in terms of reading from the teleprompter. He's making very few mistakes in terms of that. So his personal appearance is really improving. And I'm not critical of everything they're doing, but in this case, it was a bombastic hyperbola, you know, like just going off the top. Save the world! We have to do it! Save the world! There's Nazis and trying to take over! Watch out for the Nazis! You know, this is our last chance to save democracy. But this country is not I forget what it's called. It's not a granular democracy. It's a representative democracy. That's what it is. It's a representative democracy. So you elect senators and you elect congressmen, and then they vote about the laws. And then one thing, the public votes for the president and the vice president and certain other things and so forth. But basically, the business is taken care of by representatives who are 99% corrupt. There's no arguing about that, you know, inside trading and everything. But going to the mass, having the population do all of the voting will just lead to the lowest common denominator of responsibility. That's my observation. The crowd will always vote for a free lunch and lower working hours and less responsibility, more vacations, a pool in every backyard. And I want to go out with blah, blah, whoever your favorite cheerleader is that month. Everybody wants everything right now, forever. So, you know, that's what's going on. But, you know, if you're just going to push for this, it's probably going to fall over because of two people. Because if they get it, if whatever they do, if they don't hold on to control in the Senate and the House, they're going to lose it in, you know, January 7th of 2023 or something. You know, it's going to flip back and forth. There's going to be revenge.
Right. Okay, well, let's bring Dennis in. Dennis, your comments about the voting rights issue. Dennis, come on. Dennis, your comments. You just have to unmute, Dennis. Well, what we're talking about, you're listening to Going Viral.news. We're talking about the speech today that President Biden made in Atlanta on the whole issue of the Voting Rights Act and the need to have a Voting Rights Act put in. And then, of course, the pushback he's gotten from people down in Georgia who are not too happy. They said, look, you're coming down here making a symbolic BS comment. You know, what about staying up in Washington and actually doing something about it? But Dennis, what do you think about all this?
I agree with them. You ought to stay in Washington and do what's necessary to solve problems. I still think of Biden as a corporate Democrat, and not much, and not much of an activist, and certainly not a liberal. And I don't know. Democrats are not the answer. I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, okay. That's fair. Thank you. The depression, but let me turn to this story. Now, this story got a lot of national attention. This is this tragic story in the Bronx, but let me just play this piece from the BBC about this.
When you see kids like fighting for their life after that they are now they're deceased.
You gotta read it.
I heard her, she like, help me, I got a baby. Can't see nothing now. This is crazy.
Those that's in the hospital beds, we ask you to work through the doctors. We ask you, Lord God, to let you be the doctor that will heal the bodies of these families.
Always hear the fire alarm going off, so it's something that we're used to. You know, how was you supposed to know if the fire is always going off? And I looked out the back of the window, and that's what we see, like the fire just fighting outside the window. And they have to break open the windows to let people out.
It started in a malfunctioning electric space heater. The door to that apartment, unfortunately, when the residents left, was left open. It did not close by itself. The smoke spread throughout the building.
Open that door, the smoke just hit us. And we ran to the hallway to the exit, and I just panicked.
Landlords cutting corners. They should have sprinklers in the building. No fire escape or nothing, so how people gonna survive? Oh man, please man, start breathing.
They must gotta leave if they stop like that.
The building had over 24 code violations and complaints. So that happened this weekend, and I guess the key thing is that it was caused by a heater in an apartment that caused a spark or whatever happened, and then they didn't close the door when they fled when it started to burn in the apartment, and then due to the fact that the building had not maintained certain doors, one door didn't automatically close, so the plume of smoke went up, and most of the people were killed by smoke inhalation. But the fact that they needed superheaters, living in a basically, I guess, a public housing complex, and most of the people were immigrants from Gambia who died, including a lot of kids, a lot of children, a lot of kids 4 or 5 years old, etc. But what had struck me about this was, one, the code violations, two, the fact that there's a cold wave going through New York, and a lot of these apartments don't get adequate heat. I mean, if you go down to an apartment, let's say, where someone's paying $2,000 to $3,000 to $4,000 a month rent, well, that's like going into to the jungles of the Guadalcanal or something like that. It's like steam heaven. Whereas you go into these apartments in these other areas, they just don't get adequate heat. So to me, it's quite a telling tale of the kind of inequities that exist in New York in terms of housing. But in any event, I just wanted to throw that up. I just wondered if anybody had any other comments about this, because, it's going to be a big deal. They're going to make a big deal in terms of the issue of the fire, and they're going to blame it on the people using the heaters, which of course cause a lot. We're talking about electrical heaters, of course, cause a lot of fire, but nevertheless, why are they using the heaters? Why are they forced to use electric heaters? Because they don't have adequate heat in the apartments. And that is a question of how the landlords operate.
And
but anyway,
I have to say, Jim, that has always been a problem with landlords in New York. It is going to get worse because of climate change. No matter what you say, argue about climate change, it is having an immediate effect, a real and immediate effect on local weather systems. And therefore, if we see cold like we did today in New York, we're going to see people are going to need space heaters. I mean, they don't want to freeze to death, just like they don't want to burn to death. And basically, that's what they're going to be given the choice. So the city has got to crack down. But this has been going on for decades and decades. And by the way, there are even higher rent apartments that don't get enough heat. These buildings, when they have violations, and I know of buildings that have had dozens of violations year after year after year, and they pay the fine because the fine is minimal. And if somebody doesn't say, "Hey, you don't fix it, you're out," and the city will take over the building, or the city will or the city will then sell the building to somebody else. In other words, I mean, I don't know how legal that would be, but the fact is,
as you recall, Michael, as you recall, and all of us are New Yorkers here. As you recall, in the 70s, there were tons of abandoned buildings, because the landlords. I mean, I was actually offered to move into an abandoned building and remake it, and I had to put in $5,000, which I didn't have at the time. But you had 7 or 8 people coming in with $5,000 a piece, and they were eventually purchasing a property that probably now is worth about $4 million or $5 million. In other words, renovating a brownstone. But there were hundreds and hundreds of abandoned apartment buildings, thousands of them, all throughout the city of New York. But this issue of the heat, I think, is quite telling. But anyway, I just want to hear what other people have to say about this. Alex or Kenny or Dennis, why don't you all chime in simultaneously? Let's have a big argument about this.
This is public housing.
You've been
this is housing.
Yeah.
what was it, like 40 stories high?
It's, you know, it looks like about 15 or 16 stories high.
Yeah, so there's how many projects like that? How much is that all
Well,
over
lots
the
of
city?
places like that. Lots of places like that. The Bronx has the highest amount of public housing in of any borough in the city.
Okay.
So
about once every 5 years, you get a calamity like this, I guess.
well, this is a pretty big one. I mean, this is the worst one in a long time. But anyway.
Okay. What is the sitting body? What is the body that investigates this and deals with the noncompliance with orders to repair?
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch.
Department of Housing, I think.
Department of Housing, the fire department. I'm sure it's going to be a political issue in the city council.
Yeah, there has to be. I mean, I ran into organizations and government, you could find them in not compliance, and then you go like, all they'll say is, okay, we're going to comply from now on. There's no consequences. Without consequences, you won't get change. Unless people go to jail for violating civil codes, there will never be a change.
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, what they're comparing it to, of course, is what happened in London. I think that Fennel housing in London, it was also essentially public housing, was council housing, and the whole damn building burned. It was a big apartment fire in London, if you recall, about, I think, in the past 2 years.
Yeah, but we also had a thing in Florida where a building collapsed because they didn't deal with right. They didn't deal with things that were observed. Hey, we got Gail has just joined us.
Gail has joined us. Thank you, Gail.
That's good. Okay, so it's a tragedy. What can you do? And
you want an opinion from me?
Yeah.
Yeah, go on, Dennis. What's your thoughts about this, Dennis?
Well, I think that public housing has been sabotaged by the real estate interests. It's really it's underinvested, and they want it to be. It's just like public transportation. It's also sabotaged by the private industry. I think that anything that is public has been sabotaged, except for subsidies for the rich. Anything that's subsidies for the working class and poor, or even middle class, are fought against by the establishment capitalists. And I would say the problem is capitalism. And what we need to do is to be serious about being socialist, and we need to build our own party, a massive party that actually is free of capitalist influence. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you raise that, because that's what I was actually listening to, a discussion today about the Democratic Socialists of America running in elections throughout the country. And what really impressed me, these were all politicos. These were all people who teach politics or actually are active in politics. And what they were pointing out to me was how the big takeaway was how the DSA really does well in low turnout primaries. And then they can actually dominate the low turnout primary. And they're comparing that, for example, they're talking about the woman who got elected in Buffalo and then was defeated in the write-in candidate by the guy who she defeated. But anyway, that's a different thing. But what we're talking about, you're listening to Going Viral.news. We've been joined with Gail Aronow. We're talking about the what happened up in the Bronx over in the past couple of days with this tragedy of this housing unit being burned and all these people being killed in the fire. And Gail, I wonder what thoughts you have about that.
Never buy an electric space heater. It's dangerous as hell. Really dangerous. We used to use them on wooden boats with grave trepidation. It's a known fact. They burst into flames and they start fires. I'm talking about a certain relative of yours, Jim.
Right, exactly. Alex, your comment about all this.
Well,
Alex,
another It's similar but different again. Remember the Grenville fire a few years
The
ago.
Grenville, is
Two,
that what I'm
three
talking about?
fires
The
over
Grenville?
in the UK. That was, of course, worse because I think that dozens of people were killed in that. And of course, the circumstances there were different. Again, that was they're using illegal cladding of the repairs they were doing on the building that caught fire, but it was also, it was about the neglect of housing there. Similar, and again
Now we're going to return to our breaking news. The
use of
sad
illegal
news that the actor
materials by
Sidney
the
Poitier,
landlord in that case.
groundbreaking
So
Hollywood star,
it all
has
goes back
indeed
to, as
died.
Dennis was saying, capitalism, but also, the particular acts of landlords in these cases to basically cut corners for safety.
Now we're going to return
of
to our
their,
breaking news. The sad news.
their the people who live in their apartments because they want to, because everything is about making a buck. And as we know, capitalism, everything is about profits. So everything is lesser to that point, including, again...
Before you keep scrolling, I want to hear from you. I'm personally asking you to take 1 minute, only 1 minute, and fill out.
He was a legend among the
Jim,
stars.
Jim, you got to either get on the stool and start sharing or not. You're interrupting our dialogue with this intermittent cuts.
Yeah, maybe you should just... We
Do you
want to
move
talk
on
about
to
Sidney
Sidney
Poitier,
Poitier?
so maybe you want to play that, Jim, yeah.
Just play it. Take the stage.
Oh, this is I thought I was sorry, I apologize. I thought I had that muted.
No.
All right, so here is a piece from Entertainment tonight about the death of Sidney Poitier.
Tonight, we celebrate the triumphant life and legacy of the greatest of all time, Sidney Poitier.
Welcome to Entertainment Tonight, and we are standing by Mr. Poitier's star here on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He was a man of elegance, grace, and dignity, and Hollywood has lost an icon.
I can pull that fat cat down. I can bring him right off this hill. Amen, amen. Do you know that money is made out of my father's flesh?
I've had more than most actors. I have had the opportunity to work in films that transcended their times.
Mom, this is John.
It is my nature to make the kind of film that would make a comment.
I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Drayton.
There are great actors and there are important actors. Sidney Poitier was both.
How did I break through? I think I had great good luck on my side, and I also think I came along historically at the right time.
It is a long journey to this moment.
This was our last glimpse of Sidney. He was using a cane and leaving a West Hollywood restaurant in 2018. The 94-year-old icon passed away in the Bahamas, where he was raised.
Our country is in mourning. I've instructed that the Bahamian flag be flown at half-mast.
Do you think you would have turned out to be as splendid a man as you are if you hadn't had such a tough, hard struggle?
Well, that's a double-edged question. I mean, you're first of all presupposing that I've turned out splendidly. I know too many people who would question that.
At birth, Sidney weighed less than 3 pounds. He was so frail that his father, a tomato farmer, built him a coffin. But when a fortune teller predicted Sidney would be world famous, his parents threw the small coffin away.
I left the Bahamas, I left the Caribbean, and I went to New York at the age of 15. And I survived there with no friends, no money, no relations, no one.
Sidney acted in more than 40 films. His groundbreaking roles inspired a generation, especially Oprah Winfrey. This morning, she shared this photo and wrote, "For me, the greatest of the great trees has fallen, Sidney Poitier."
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
I want to ask you about Sidney Poitier's importance in Hollywood. And I say that in not just his movies, but his position in Hollywood.
There is no one on earth I love more. There's no one who I have greater respect or regard for.
Sidney was the first black man to win an Academy Award. Lilies of the Field earned him the Oscar for Best Actor, and that night in 1964 impacted a 10-year-old Oprah and countless others forever.
The winner is Sidney Poitier. I still see the image of him when Anne Bancroft hands him the Academy Award. And I was profoundly, when I tell you profoundly, I could start weeping right now. I was profoundly, deeply, sincerely moved by that moment because I had never seen, we were being called colored people at the time, I had never seen a colored man look like that. And I just thought, if he could do that, I wonder what I could do.
Wow.
And that was at 10 years old. And because he did that, I was able to do what I have been able to do in the world. And every single other Black person who followed, it only happened because he was able not just to do that, but to be that.
Can you briefly recall for me how you felt the night you got your award?
It was extraordinary. It was remarkable. It was like, it was great. What can I tell you?
What can I give you in return?
Some of his most memorable roles included playing a high school teacher in working-class London in To Sir with Love and a detective in the Deep South in the Heat of the Night.
What works of his really touch you?
I love Who's Coming to Dinner because the scene in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner where he says,
But you think of yourself as a colored man.
And I think of myself as a man, that is who he is.
Sidney was also a mentor to Denzel Washington. When he was a young actor, Denzel met his idol in a bookstore.
I took out my picture and resume.
Did you really?
I sure did. He was like, well, son, I don't think this is the appropriate place.
He was young, he was skinny, Denzel was. But there was the flavor of what was to come.
The Oscars in 2002 would deepen their bond. It was then the Academy gave special recognition to Sidney with an honorary award. And later in the night, Denzel won Best Actor with his idol watching.
40 years I've been chasing Sidney. They finally give it to me. What they do, they give it to him the same night. I'll always be chasing you, Sidney. I'll always be following in your footsteps.
Today, in a statement to E.T., Denzel said, "It was a privilege to call Sidney Poitier my friend. He was a gentle man and opened doors for all of us that had been closed. God bless him and his family."
Republicans are trying to
All right,
disenfranchise.
well, you're Chuck Schumer. Michael, why don't you chime in here because you wanted to talk about Sidney Poitier.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Everything that was said there was all true. I remember when I was a kid, you know, I wanted to be Sidney Poitier. Everybody wanted to be Sidney Poitier. He was, you know, typecast for the hero, if you want to say that. But he did fight against typecasting, not just for African American actors, but for himself as an actor. So he had to fight against typecasting and stereotype on both fronts. But there was a couple of things, a couple of breakthroughs that he made that have not been talked about in the media that much. A couple of much more subtle breakthroughs. First of all, as an actor, obviously, I mean, I personally considered his greatest role to be A Raisin in the Sun. For me, as an actor, it was one of the best performances I've seen on film. And as I have been told, I was too young to have seen it on Broadway, but they said he was just as stunning in the Broadway show. And that, of course, the play itself was a breakthrough. It was the first play by a female African-American playwright. Lou Peterson, who was my teacher at university, was the first African-American playwright on Broadway a couple of years before. But Sidney Poitier really did a stunning performance, did the film, and that really cemented his status. I mean, he had done the Defiant Ones, he had done several other great roles, but that really cemented his reputation as a great actor. And that in itself was a breakthrough also. It wasn't just saying, oh, African-American performers can be, you know, idolized or hero worshipped, but also that they can be recognized for their innate talent, so that he had risen above all of the racial issues, the racism of the time, to be seen that way. But I remember also when I was a kid, he did a film called The Bedford Incidents, which is a Cold War thriller in 1965. It was based on a best-selling book, and he did it with his friend and also fellow progressive in Hollywood, Richard Widmark. He, in the book, the character was not African American. He was, when they describe the characters, when they have a character description in the book, he was shown as being more having like, well, basically being Caucasian, red hair, Irish features, or whatever. But there was nothing about the book, about the plot or the character, that necessitated him being white or black or any ethnicity. So it was a no-brainer that a major star and a person, as I said, cut from the cloth, being the hero, would play this part. And the part he played was the protagonist to Richard Widmark's kind of right-wing antagonist. And what it did, what roles like that did, he did a few movies like that, in which he played the role in which the audience was supposed to identify. So in order to follow the film, in order to participate in the film, you had to identify with Sidney Poitier's character. And I said he did this in a couple of other movies, notably also in To Serve With Love and A Patch of Blue, in which he was also this incredibly heroic figure. But when he did that, what it did in a very subtle way, as fighting against racism, was to force the population as a whole, not just African Americans or minorities, but to force everyone who wanted to see those films and enjoy those films, those particular films, to identify with his character and with his portrayal of that character, which means that the United States, the majority of the United States who wanted to get involved in these films, had to see themselves in the guise of Sidney Poitier. Now, again, this did not wipe out racism any more than Barack Obama's election to the presidency did. But it was a subtle and very interesting step forward, a progressive step forward, in that it began to, as his line in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, when he says, "I see myself as a man," it forced people to at least take one step out of the racism or the systemic racism that was around, and say, wait a second, this is me. This is me in that film, etc. Then I think that was an important, the fact that he did that. I remember that movie in particular, because it was basically a Cold War thriller. But in films like that, he had taken that step of making the United States, of becoming representative of either the average American or the best of America.
Okay, Jim, Mike, what about the producer, director, and writer? It's not all on his shoulders, right?
No. I'm talking about when Sidney Poitier was cast in the part. He did a marvelous job playing it.
Okay,
of course,
but what about the director, the producer, and the writer?
It was co-produced by Richard Widmark, who was a friend of Poitier's and also a very progressive person in Hollywood. There's no doubt about that. But I think these steps, but he did it with Poitier, he did it in several films. There was a film he did called The Slender Thread. It was, of course, A Patch of Blue, where he played a journalist, somebody working for a newspaper. And these were both at the same time everyman roles and heroic roles. So it means he captured what we would see ourselves or could identify with, what we could easily, at least in my case, but I'm sure in many other people's cases, what they at least could, wanted to, or should identify with and at the same time what they would aspire to be.
So he was a good actor, but he always played a compassionate lead. He never played a villain or a psychopath or something like that. Pardon me?
He wanted to play a villain. He was an actor, so he said, I'm tired of playing these heroic parts. So he and Richard Widmark did a film called The Long Shifts, in which he played the antagonist, and the film made about $2.50. It bombed at the box office because nobody wanted to see Sidney Poitier playing the bad guy role.
Controversial.
Yeah, but as an actor, he wanted to expand. And prior, in the late 50s and early 60s, he was doing roles. I mean, The Defiant Ones and Raisin in the Sun. In Raisin in the Sun, he becomes heroic, if you want to use that term, heroic at the end, but he sinks down to his character sinks down to the bottom, and then rises up to the top, so to speak. I'm talking about in his dignity as a human being, but he had these great roles, these wonderful roles, but in the early to mid 60s, he started going into these other roles because he was a movie star. In 1967, he was the #1 movie star in the world.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Box office?
Box office, especially. He had Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night, and oh God, I've got the third film. Oh, and To Sir with Love. They all came out within the same 1 year span. Or they were, may have been made previously, but they came out then. And Sidney Poitier was the top of the top, and he had been building up to that. He had been close to that for the couple of years prior. Sidney Poitier was a major movie star and a major icon. So at that point, he was kind of past the point where he could just play roles only because they were great acting roles. However, in these heroic roles, he still did marvelous jobs of acting. He still infused it with great acting.
He's the greatest actor you've ever known or seen.
Well, he's one of the. I mean, I could name a few other.
One of the top 50.
Oh, definitely.
One of the top 20.
Yes.
Maybe the top 10.
Perhaps.
Okay.
Well.
I never saw.
Let's go around. Let's see if we got concurrence on
that.
Let's see what kind of a fan club we can build up here. Let's give somebody else a shot at it. Gloria.
Well, let me start it off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me start it off. Now, he was probably he was close to Canada Lee. Canada Lee was one of the black actors who was sort of pilloried during the McCarthy period. He actually started Canada Lee back in 40s, early 50s. And what's interesting when Michael brings up The Long Ships was a movie that is sort of interesting because it's during the period of time that Tito was making all these different movies, and basically it was shot in Yugoslavia. So Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier were actually the fjords are actually the coastline of Yugoslavia. It was a movie shot and organized. It was when Tito was trying to break out into the international market. And what's interesting about the Bedford incident, was directed by James Harris.
Who?
With James Harris.
Damn, your mic. You're not using the mic.
Sure as hell am. Right on the mic, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
That movie was directed by James Harris. James Harris had split with Stanley Kubrick over the movie Dr. Strangelove. And he had basically said, I want to do a serious movie about the Cold War, not a farce. And so Harris went and did that movie. Now, how Sidney Poitier got into it obviously had to do with Richard Widmark. But anyway, he and his box office draw, he was the biggest box office draw in '67. There's no doubt about it. He was the most successful Hollywood actor at that time financially in 1967. That was the peak of his career. And then it started to decline, but nevertheless, a tremendous influence. And it was sort of moving to see Oprah Winfrey talk about when she saw him win the Academy Award and how that affected her. But anyway, I'll shut up now. Let others talk.
What about Gail? Gail, what do you think?
Well, I think it's really fascinating. First of all, for better or worse, I'm this sort of on the fringe of academe with all this stuff about, it's all, let's just say, political correctness, for want of a better phrase, to sort of wrap up a lot of our culture at this very moment. But actually, if you lived through the 60s and you saw Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, were they both Bahamian? Bahamian? How do you say it? Anyway,
no, actually, Harry Belafonte was, I believe, from Trinidad, but go on.
But Harry Belafonte was a major source in the music industry. I mean, a linchpin, very, very important. And I only know this through my, jazz musician uncle, who knew him pretty well. And he was a big force to be reckoned with. So maybe things are just going downhill around here. I don't know, that with all the emphasis on polarization among the races or between the races, but it sure didn't feel like that at the time I, as a little tweenie, went to see those movies or listen to Harry Belafonte. Nobody was thinking about him as this, arch hero. He was a great actor, right? There wasn't so much of an emphasis on black, white, green, purple, whatever. It just wasn't, he was acting because he knew how to act. Did it shock people? Maybe. I mean, I guess I asked myself that question. Did all the, American moviegoers look at him and think he's even greater than he is as an actor? He's even greater than he is as a very good actor because he's not like us? I have no idea. I mean, it's kind of a scary question to ask. Maybe
I'll chime in on that. Yeah, I was in pre-teen years then with Belafonte. We were all singing Deo and all the songs on that. A little bit jealous about how gorgeous he looked, attractive. The cummerbund with the big circle in the middle, and he's very, very handsome. And same way with black actors like Sidney Poitier or any black actors. They're just playing a role, unless they're playing a part, something to do about 12 years of slavery or something that highlights that. I was really, really admirable had a lot of appreciation for Denzel Washington and the director, which is Spike Lee, right, of X, or Malcolm X. That was an incredible movie. I was really disappointed when that didn't get the Academy Award for Best Picture. It was obviously one of the best pictures of the decade. And, strong performances and Spike Lee's thing. And, he's, so in terms of like who has moved forward the community or the participation or the recognition or the acceptance of more African Americans in society, it's a bunch of different performers and people in the industry and so forth. And Sidney Poitier did okay. But, a lot of times movie stars, they're like the royalty in America. Everybody's going, ooh. I remember my wife goes, I saw Sidney in the supermarket around the corner here. He's such stature. He's such a handsome gentleman, big and tall. You don't recognize how tall and solid he is and straight, because we're all walking around like this. He's straight, dignified, his chest out, and said, and so forth. So celebrities have status all over the world. There's probably about 3,000 people that are known by more than their immediate friends. There's only like 3,000 names, like George Soros, Brad Pitt, what's the president's name? Joe Biden, Donald Trump. I've heard that name before. There's only a certain number of people who have recognition. Sidney Poitier is one of them. But I'll tell you the truth, Sidney Poitier is not going to be known by people who are under 30. Because even though those are classic movies, none of them moved forward. I don't know, I haven't done a survey on it, but I know I make jokes about Boris Karloff and people squint. What are you talking? What's a Boris Karloff? I never heard of that. Is that a special drink or something? You know, because they don't know what we know. So I don't know if Bogey's still up there or Mitchum or Gary Cooper. You know, you could be blowing in the wind and nobody will. Who are you talking about? Someday Bob Dylan will be gone. I know the Beatles will fly. But I've talked to people who said, what's the Beatles? I swear to God, what's the Beatles? And so, you know, fame is transient. There's only a few people who persist over time. So I don't know what impact Poitier's had. He's had an impact, obviously, on his own community because he was a reputable person. He never ran into a scandal like Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was a king of the world, worldwide, popular, #1 performer, incredible talent, just amazing. You know, he wrote the music, he did the dancing, he did the singing, his showmanship, everything. And then, you know, got knocked out with a pedophilia or something like that, or some other things, or too much plastic surgery. So, but Sidney Poitier, no smudges on him. He's clean all the way. You know, every once in a while, a congressman or a celebrity gets dinged or knocked out on the Me Too movement or something else, or financial thing or something. But Poitier was clean all the way. And I guess Denzel Washington is too. I never heard anything bad about him. And he has, in my opinion, played a much broader range of characters. He's played like invalids, you know, and the Hurricane movie, different characters, different pieces. Mostly, he's not like a real character actor. He doesn't do accents and stuff, but he does play people who have a different background than just a hero background. You know, he's done that crazy Guardian movie, and then he did the crazy one where he's carrying a Bible. I forgot the name of it. And, you know, so crazy. Science fiction movies. He did 3 or 4 science fiction movies, including The Manchurian Candidate, and which is kind of like science fiction. But he did one with John Lithgow that was science. So he's got a broad range, and he must have done, I'm just guessing, he must have done 100, 120 movies at least. You know, I'm not going to count him up, but so he's done it. He's a real workhorse, and he doesn't shy away from challenges. So he did Macbeth. So we'll see how that turned out. So but so Poitier's okay. He's reputable, but I think there's a little bit too much hype.
Yeah, I just want to make a corrective.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a correction to myself. Harry Belafonte, both Sidney and Harry Belafonte were born in the United States. Poitier in Miami and Belafonte in New York, in Harlem. But Belafonte is of Jamaican descent. And also you have to remember that Denzel Washington would be the first. I mean, he was friends with Sidney Poitier, and he idolized him when he was younger. And he said the way was paved for him to be able to do this by Sidney Poitier and, of course, Harry Belafonte.
Yeah.
Well, no, but Sidney Poitier, look, Sidney Poitier, Belafonte, Ozzie Davis, Ruby Dee, all these folks were associated with WPA projects, and particularly Belafonte and Sidney Poitier were associated with the African Negro Theater, which was up at 135th Street. And they used to put on Shakespeare free in the park up in Harlem during World War II. And so Sidney Poitier was associated with that effort. So was Belafonte after the war. And so there's a whole layer of Poitier and Belafonte and their relationship with Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee, which is very important in terms of laying a groundwork for an independent theater. And the ANT was actually formed with the ideas of W.B. Du Bois in its intent. It was theater for and by and of African American people. It was a very interesting experiment. It lasted 10 years. It ironically failed because they took an immigrant film called Lucastia, where they had Joan Crawford playing it, and she was actually, it was supposed to be about a Polish immigrant, and they changed the nature of it to an African American immigrant, and it caused a big internal conflict within the A&T. But that's sort of part of the complex landscape of African American art and theater in New York City. But Alex, your comment.
Wait, Jim. No, I never heard of that. What was it called again? AMT, American.
Well, you know, it's called the African Negro Theater. It was actually on 135th Street in Harlem. It's ironic. It operated in the basement of the New York Public Library, which people forget that during the Depression, all these different, I mean, we were this sort of funny for Mike and me and Gail and Alex, because we were actually doing something for a number of years at one of the biggest spaces in New York City, the New York Public Library system. It had space down there to put on drama, and the A&T actually operated in a New York Public Library theater in the basement to put on its plays. So that's how.
Not
Poitier,
not Sidney Poitier and Denzel Washington.
Yeah.
People before them.
No, it was no. Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte were involved with this. But let me hear Alex what he has to say about this.
Right. Well, I'm the one here that wasn't around to see Sidney Poitier do these performances in the theater again. Unless it's some kind of retrospective of, in the heat of the night, or, usually it's either on like DVD, VHS back in the day, or, they're showing it on the TV, showing, To Serve with Love on, the Saturday, movie or so on. So, it's a little different. I mean, I wasn't there at the time, but so I know more from, what people said subsequently about his influence, which of course is considerable. And, there's the issue of trailblazing, essentially, again, being, the first Black Academy Award winner. I mean, again, we could, and I take, Ken's point too, that, if we think about it, did he have any? I don't think he had any hits, once we get to the 70s, right? So obviously he was also, we could argue that, he's, his key period was in the middle, the civil rights era, and that I would say there probably is some kind of connection with that in terms of what Americans wanted to see with a Black actor at the time. And, again, the kind of roles that he did, serving that kind of function, of course, again, says nothing about, a particular intent by Sidney Poitier, just that he was kind of in the right place at the right time to some extent, which is, always going to be the case with a great film, that it meets the kind of films that resonate, the films that meet their particular moment. So that's, that's something interesting to think about too, in terms of always fitting him into the political, but also cultural environment when, he was so popular and doing all of these great films.
He plays Nelson Mandela in a movie about the negotiations with de Klerk. So he kept on having an impact. But Dennis, what's your opinion about Sidney Poitier?
Oh, by the way, just before we go to Dennis, Alex, he also played Thurgood Marshall and won an Emmy for that. But he also in the 70s, he had some hit films, but he had directed. They were films he directed.
Right.
That were the biggest.
Right.
Hit.
He had an impact. Dennis, your comments about Sidney Poitier, Dennis? Dennis.
You gotta mute.
No, he's unmuted. Alex, why don't you share some stories that you have?
Okay. So let me. All right. So first, let's go to the UK, and some, well, difficulties. Our friend Boris, I wouldn't say our friend, but Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, is getting more hot water to the extent that people are calling for him to resign over these parties that he had in the middle of COVID. You can see him right here at the bottom. Obviously not outside, but not socially distanced. So this has created a huge uproar in calls, and we'll see in Parliament for him to, go. So let's listen to Al Jazeera talk about this.
How many garden parties is a garden party too far? This image shows Boris Johnson at a gathering behind 10 Downing Street during the first lockdown in May 2020. His office has always claimed this was a work meeting. Now he's under intense pressure after press reports he attended another gathering here 5 days later, along with dozens of colleagues. An email from one of his advisors to 100 members of staff said, "Hi all, after what has been an incredibly busy period, we thought it would be nice to make the most of the lovely weather and have some socially distanced drinks in the number 10 garden this evening. Please join us from 6 p.m. and bring your own booze." And I know that people are also eager for news. The same day, the Culture Secretary was on television telling the public they shouldn't meet more than one person from another household. In Parliament on Tuesday, the opposition was granted an urgent question.
To ask the Prime Minister to make a statement on reports of events held in the Downing Street Garden on the 20th of May 2020.
Boris Johnson didn't turn up, leaving it to a cabinet colleague to fend off repeated calls for him to resign.
I apologise again, unreservedly, for the upset that these allegations have caused. The Prime Minister has asked for an investigation to take place, and the terms of reference for the investigations that are underway have already been published.
In recent months, the press has been full of reports of social gatherings in Downing Street where COVID-19 regulations were broken. But this time it feels different. Johnson has refused to deny anything, saying only that there'll be an investigation by Sue Gray, a senior civil servant. Well, the reaction of the former head of the Scottish Conservatives was particularly acerbic on Tuesday. She said nobody needs an official to tell them whether they were at a boozy shindig in their own garden. Well, apart from Sue Gray's investigation, the police here now say they're in touch with the Cabinet Office over those reports of a garden party. The government's official number of people who've died from COVID-19 has just passed 150,000. No surprise then that the airwaves have been full of people who lost loved ones in 2020 and weren't allowed to attend their funerals, condemning the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson's popularity ratings have already slumped in recent months. Whether this latest scandal translates into any real attempts by his party to replace him is less clear. Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera, London.
Right, so honestly, again, it's unclear so far what impact this is going to have on him, and whether this might even force him out of the premiership. But obviously, it's not. It doesn't look good at all. Yeah.
I just want to say,
Mike, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, it's ironic. It'd be ironic if this does. I mean, it'd be a good thing, but ironic if this is the thing that forces him out with all the other garbage that he's pulled, more substantial garbage.
Right.
But on the other hand, this could just be the nail in the coffin for him. So,
right.
I don't know.
Yeah, he's not done well. It's amazing that his numbers are so high, but that has more to do with how crappy labor opposition is. Keir Starmer in particular. All right, but let's. If nobody else wants to say anything else, I did want to play this. Get more into.
I'm offended that I wasn't invited to that party. That's all.
Well, you would have to fly there, Ken, and you which you couldn't. I don't think, I don't think they would have let you into the UK with the COVID restrictions, because you'd be coming from a worse country for COVID. I think wherever that would have been in April. I think. I don't think you could have even flown if you wanted to, or taken a boat into England from the U.S. So
I could have no.
If you could have teleported,
I would go to France and go with the refugees coming in across the boat there with it over. Land at Dover. Okay, let's go next.
If Boris wanted him to go,
they would have just changed the rules for him. Don't worry.
That's right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to do a little bit more with
That looks like Neil
with the
Simon.
Russia,
Neil
with the
Simon.
Ukraine stuff, because this is very interesting. We won't play the whole thing again, so it's 30 minutes. Well, actually, let me set it up to play a little faster. So this is Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone. He's going to interview someone, Jim and Mike and me, Colonel Doug MacGregor, who used to be Trump's military advisor. And they're going to talk about what Colonel MacGregor, again, who is a very idiosyncratic retired military officer. He's kind of like Colonel David Hackworth. He's one of these guys who's really went up against the military establishment, questioned a lot of assumptions, and is, goes, let's say, a very different way. So he's going to talk about here to Aaron about what's going on in the Ukraine and his thoughts. We'll see, he includes that he does think Putin's going to invade the Ukraine, but that he actually defends, says that that's the right thing for Putin to do, that Putin is just basically serving Russia's interests. The U.S. has pushed the Russians too far, and we're going to face the consequences. But this is, I thought that was interesting.
Well, before you play that, Alex, I know Doug personally. Doug is somebody who was brought in November to be a replacement for Esper. He was part of the whole group brought in by Trump to set up. I mean, Doug would effectively look on, who would take orders from Trump to launch a military coup. So I think that has to be said when you listen to someone like Doug. That's his background. He was brought in by Trump to be in a position. He was actually recommended by General Flynn. So anyway, all right, let's hear what Doug has to say.
Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Mate. Joining me is Douglas MacGregor. He is a retired Army colonel who served as the former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Doug MacGregor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
I want to start with the current flashpoint of Ukraine. The U.S. and Russia have been in the midst of a showdown over essentially the status of Ukraine, whether it will join NATO or not, and the status of U.S. forces there and U.S. military aid. Adam Schiff, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, he recently said that he believes that a Russia invasion of Ukraine is very likely.
What specifically would stop Vladimir Putin from his aggression? Do you need to cut that country off from the global financial system to sanction him personally?
Well, I think that it would require enormous sanctions on Russia to deter what appears to be a very likely Russian invasion of Ukraine again.
That's a prevailing view in Washington, D.C. right now. I'm wondering your assessment of that prospect. Do you agree that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is very likely?
Well, this is one of the few occasions where I can agree with something that Adam Schiff has said. Yes, I think it's very likely to happen towards the end of January, beginning of February, in all likelihood.
My name is Andre Cruz. I'm 32 years old, and on what grounds do you believe that?
Well, there are several. First of all, the problems in Ukraine are not new. We've been dealing with them for the last, I would argue, 10 to 15 years. These problems were evident in the 1990s when the former Soviet Union fragmented into various states. The current borders of Ukraine never made a great deal of sense because Ukraine is essentially a multinational state. You have in the east, that is beyond the Dnieper River, to the south down to Odessa on the coast, what is really a Russian population. The rest of Ukraine is actually historic Ukraine. It goes back to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And that part of Ukraine is inhabited by true Ukrainians in terms of ethnicity as well as culture and language. Putting this together has always been problematic, particularly because Ukrainians have wanted to turn the Russians into Ukrainians. The Russians aren't terribly excited about that prospect and have complained bitterly about it. And Putin, from the very beginning of his presidency, tried to make it clear to anyone who would listen that there were certain things that he would not tolerate as the Russian head of state. And one of those was that Ukraine become a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He also had concerns about the EU because that was seen as another mechanism with which to integrate Ukraine into the West. Then finally, he became very concerned about the plight of the Russians Crimea is historically never part of Ukraine and has been part of Russia since 1776. And so he was anxious to relieve that burden on the Russians in Crimea by driving the Ukrainians out, and he did that in 2014. But he also wanted to ensure that we understood that we were never going to be able to use Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, and the ports on the Crimean Peninsula for NATO naval forces or any other forces. We didn't pay any attention. We attacked him viciously. We essentially ignored any of his expression of concern or interest in Ukraine from the standpoint of Moscow's national security. And we have always refused to acknowledge the Russian concern that NATO is threatening to Russia. We've insisted absolutely not. But we don't have far to look over the last 20 years at the various regime change operations that Washington has staged to appreciate Putin's concerns. But instead of addressing those concerns in a substantive way, taking into account what Russia's interests are, we've essentially said that they're illegitimate. And the only interests that are legitimate are our own and those of our quote-unquote NATO allies. So here we sit. We're looking at a force of 130, 150, 180,000. I don't know what it will be when the day approaches, but a force that is substantial enough to seize the Russian-speaking areas that are east of the Dnieper River and, frankly, all the way out to Odessa if he decides to do it. There's not a great deal we can do about it.
I know that Russia already has, senior military forces there, is providing military equipment to its allies in Ukraine. But I mean, a full-scale invasion. Do you think? I mean, practically, Russia has summoned the necessary forces to pull off such a thing? And do you think Putin would want the burden of a full-on military invasion of Ukraine? That seems to be a much higher escalation than what he's already done. And I just wonder if even if he wanted to, whether that's even feasible from a Russian point of view.
Oh, it's absolutely feasible, particularly when you look at the map and you see that he will confine his operations to the Russian-speaking areas. In many cases, I think the Russians will be welcomed as liberators. They're certainly not going to be heavily resisted by the Russian population. The resistance will come from Ukrainians. But in those areas where he's going to go, there are very few Ukrainians, if any at all. And the only Ukrainians who are there are from the Ukrainian armed forces. So I don't think that's the concern. Now, as far as launching the operation at all, I don't think Vladimir Putin has wanted to do it for a long time. But I think he feels that he has no choice. He's left no alternative because we absolutely will not acknowledge his national strategic interest in Ukraine. From the very beginning, we could have approached Ukraine very differently. But this is the biggest problem. What are our goals in Ukraine? Our goals should be that Ukraine remains independent, sovereign, free, and that may or may not have anything to do with membership in NATO. But we haven't been willing to consider that. A lot of us, I'm one of them, argued very early that the obvious solution would be Austrian-style neutrality for Ukraine. Simply no foreign bases or forces in the country. That would be threatening to Russian interests, and a willingness to let Ukraine vote its own future. If it wants to stay together, it may do so. If it doesn't, then we can certainly look at a territorial arrangement which allows the Russian areas to join Russia. Now, about 10 years ago, I think most of the population, even the Russians, said, no, let's just hold this construct together. I don't think that's the case anymore. And I think if given the choice, most of the Russians in the East would now prefer to be part of Russia.
I'm in Amsterdam, which is without a doubt the cannabis capital of the world.
So I don't think going into Ukraine from that standpoint is a big issue for Vladimir Putin. No, well, what he will not do, Aaron, is cross the Dnieper River and go into Ukraine proper, where you've got 25 million or so committed, devoted Ukrainians who will fight like hell. He doesn't want to deal with it. He's not interested in that. He's only interested in the territory, as far as I can tell, to the Dnieper River and potentially out to Odessa. That is what he's been calling Novorussia, New Russia, which is a term that first came into use under Catherine the Great, when Catherine the Great's armies ultimately conquered Crimea and essentially designated those areas as New Russia. Because before 1776, the areas that we're talking about in eastern Ukraine and Crimea were part of a Tartar Mongol Muslim Khanate for several hundred years. So bottom line is, I don't think he wants to do it, but I think he feels he has to protect the Russians that are there. He has to force this in order to get the attention of the United States and its NATO allies. I think it's going to work. I think he will. Now, how will that turn out in the long term? Well, we can speculate about all the potential consequences, but he can do it.
All right, so Russia has made its goals clear. It wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO. It wants a binding pledge that will keep Ukraine out of NATO, and also wants guarantees against the positioning of U.S. weapons, offensive U.S. weapons inside Ukraine. I'm wondering your assessment of the U.S. goals, and specifically how the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline factors into all of this, or if you think it does. Right now, this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline is under this review period in Germany. if it goes ahead, it will, further integrate Russia into the rest of Europe, and Ukraine will be bypassed. It will lose out on billions of dollars in transit fees that it collects by basically being a pass-through for Russian gas. I'm wondering if you agree with analysts who say that what the U.S. and Ukraine are doing in adopting a bellicose posture right now is basically jockeying for better leverage over Nord Stream 2 and limiting the extent to which Russia will benefit from that deal if it goes ahead.
Well, I suppose you could argue that that's part of it. But frankly, the Germans have looked to Russia for a very long time as a source of liquefied natural gas and other minerals. Keep in mind that in 1914, when World War I broke out, Russia was Germany's #1 trading partner, and Germany was Russia's #1 trading partner. And again, on the 22nd of June, 1941, Russia was Germany's #1 trading partner, and Germany was Russia's #1 trading partner. The Germans and the Russians, frankly speaking, with the exception of those two world wars, which are very anomalous, actually have a long history of cooperation. And I think the Germans and the Russians would like to get back to that because each has something the other needs. The Germans need Russia's vast natural resources, mineral resources, as well as oil and gas, timber, other things. And the Germans have the finished machine tool products, the engines, many of the technologies for automobiles and aircraft and so forth that the Russians need. So this is not a spur of the moment decision by the Germans. The second point is the Germans want to shut down all of their nuclear reactors. They want to become independent of nuclear power. The only way to do that is with more liquefied natural gas. Now, we have stepped up to the plate and offered to sell the liquefied natural gas to them. The problem is we can't sell it to them as cheaply as the Russians can. And the Russians can sell it much more cheaply and much faster, not only to Germany, but to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to Austria, Hungary, all the people in Central Europe who need liquefied natural gas through Nord Stream 2, then they can get it through Ukraine. So I think in this sense, Ukraine is bound to lose simply because the Russians have found a faster, cheaper, better solution for their European clients.
Okay, so to add on and to discuss potential sanctions that would happen if Putin invades the Ukraine. There was an interesting leak to the Washington Post a few days ago of some internal documents from the U.S. government that essentially argued that if we were to go with heavy sanctions against the Russians, that could very well hurt the U.S. economy more than Russia's. The idea is that by, of course, the price of gas would skyrocket because of blocking Russian natural gas. That would cause an economic crisis in Europe that would, lead to an economic crisis in the U.S. because, Europe is our biggest trading, the EU as a whole is our biggest trading partner. So, in fact, again, there was apparently some of the Democratic political advisors to Biden were telling people like Anthony Blinken that they can't, do all the sanctions they would want because, again, the U.S. economy would get tanked and Biden would be guaranteed to lose not only in 2022, but in 2024. So politically, it would be untenable, basically, to impose the full array of sanctions on the Russians, even if they do invade the Ukraine. But I'm sure many of you guys have some, especially Jim, have things to say in response to what Colonel MacGregor was saying here. So, Ken, or?
All I can say is, honestly, it's way over my head. But I mean, it's interesting to listen to this Colonel MacGregor.
Yeah.
Because he's a pragmatist. He's not talking about principles or types of government. That's not the kind of guy he is, no. He's talking about the fact that there's people in the Ukraine who would welcome a closer association with Russia. And that's the way it is on the ground. And you were just talking, Russia could deliver the natural gas a lot cheaper than the U.S. Nothing to do with apple pie or borscht. It's just what do you pay for the gas,
Yeah.
So they're pragmatists. We got to get Jim back because he's going to give us a lecture on it.
Well, while we're waiting for Jim, I'll chime in here. We can let
me might chime in, but I have to say you call him a pragmatist, but he doesn't seem to see Putin as a pragmatist. I don't believe that Putin's primary reason for doing this is to rescue the ethnically Russian population of that part of the Ukraine. I think, though, the idea of a buffer and have an area at least there that would not join NATO that would be his pragmatic reason. So I disagree with the guy on that one. Second of all, if Russia has this great relationship with Germany, and indeed if it has this hold on Europe, then Putin shouldn't be as worried about NATO, considering that after the fiasco of Donald Trump, the United States' influence on NATO is shakier than it was before. The United States used to have an overwhelming influence on what NATO did, but now it's a little shakier. So if Putin did have this kind of influence with the continental Europe, then he wouldn't be as worried about it. I think that as far as the sanctions go, though, Alex, there are different degrees of sanctions. There are sanctions that could be put on Russia that would hurt Russia, but not obliterate it, but that would hurt it. It really, Putin's calculation has to be, how much heat is he willing to take in order to take that part of the Ukraine.
Okay, we're going to tell. We got to go to Gail because we haven't heard from her in a long time.
Well,
so
wait a second. Let me just
finish it up.
Let me just finish the thought. Yeah, the idea is that also the idea of an invasion is a precarious, is a politically risky thing to do on the international stage. It may be popular in Russia, and that may be the criteria that he's using. But on the international stage, it's still risky to do an out-and-out invasion. Go on.
Gail.
Well, this is way out of my zone.
Yeah.
Like yours, Ken. I would defer to Jim. The only thing I could say, and I could not hear the audio all that well that Alex played, but what I did glean from it was this guy, what was coming out of this colonel's mouth sounded kind of, sort of, without really having much expertise, I could say. He's a Russian apologist that Donald Trump fed off. That's what I'm guessing. Jim, can you respond to that?
Yeah, Jim, we're all waiting on you.
Please.
Well, look, Doug was is a real character. He's a very bright guy. He was a very well decorated combat commander in Gulf War. He was actually considered to be the person who was responsible for the victory at the Battle of 73 Easting. Now, that's not known to everybody, but that was a engagement where a armored cavalry squadron took on a Iraqi division and beat it. So that's where McMaster, H.R. McMaster, was also in that battle in the same unit. So Doug, I actually met Doug when he'd come back from the Gulf War, and he was showing his home movies of 73 Easting, showing the actual battle itself that they took from the turrets of their M1 Abrams tanks. He was one of the people who was considered to be one of the finalists to be the national security advisor for Donald Trump. And he was essentially, at one point, he was going to be considered to be the ambassador to Germany. And the problem that happened was he'd made some comments about Muslim immigrants. He referred to them as invaders who are going to come to Europe and turn Europe into an Islamic state. So that sort of ended his ability to go to Germany. He also argued that martial law should be instituted on the U.S.-Mexico border, and argued that people who came across the border should be executed. All right. So Doug was not necessarily, and he also was brought in now. So that's Doug. Doug's quite controversial, and he was brought in by the White House sort of hatchet man for Trump. His name was James McEntee. He was brought in to basically be part of the defense establishment after Esper was fired and Christopher Miller was brought in. So Doug is someone who's always been rather outspoken, to say the least. And he pissed off the Army when he wrote actually a brilliant critique of the Army called Breaking the Phalanx. That was done in the early, I think it was done in the 90s, but he's a brilliant guy.
It was published early 2000s, I think, Jim, like 2002.
Okay. Yeah.
Jim, but what about his viewpoint on the Ukraine and Russia and the U.S. and NATO?
Well, he's a sort of realpolitik type guy, and so his assessment probably objectively has bears a lot of validity, because didn't he argue that he felt that Putin's probably going to invade? Is that one of the things he said to Aaron Mate?
End of January, beginning of February.
Yeah, he can, and he'll be welcomed as a conquering hero.
Right.
And what's going on right now? See, we could have played other pieces that are in the press in the past week, which basically talk about how the negotiations between the United States and the Russians aren't going too well. They're starting off with, and basically the Russians are denying that they're going to invade, and the Ukrainians are saying, we don't believe you. So, and of course the question would be, would this turn into a Munich kind of event for Biden? Because what's he going to do? What's he going to do if Putin decides to suddenly invade? And then what is he going to militarily respond? He's already said he isn't.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, he said he won't.
So Putin will say, okay, the hell with you guys. I want to make the Donbass, because I think what Doug's argument was that the Donbass would be separated. That's the area where predominantly Russian speakers who are associated with, basically Putin after they took the Crimea. Those are the guys who were being supported by the Russians for the past number of years to fight against the Ukrainians. So, he could be right. I mean, this is a pretty volatile situation going on. Then, of course, we have the other situation that happened today or yesterday, where they're reacting to Kim Jong-il shooting an ICBM into the, I think it was a demonstration. That was the Sea of Japan that went into. Jong-un. Yeah, I get them confused.
Kim Jong-il is dead.
Jong-un shooting. Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Shooting an ICBM into the. Where did that land, Alex? In the Sea of Japan? Was that?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. So that was supposedly it was like 10 times faster than the normal ICBM they shoot.
No, 10 times the speed of sound. 10 times the speed of sound.
But it's faster than a normal ICBM they normally practice shoot. So, and I think, what did the Federal Aeronautics Administration had to ground airplanes as a result of it. They didn't know where the hell the missile was heading. So, here's where you get into the question of what's the level of coordination between China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. I mean, that's a legitimate concern because, it's not to say that I'm being a conspiracy theorist, but they do exercise together militarily. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that there will be secret codicils in their cooperation to strategically, they're acting in concert objectively. So, that's sort of an interesting development for Biden. And what the hell is Biden going to do if they decide, okay, this guy's domestically weak. It looks like he's not going to be able to be reelected. And it looks like he's going to lose control of the House and the Senate in November. Let's let's call his bluff and invade. You know, like I could see Putin pulling that off, and certainly the Soviets did the same kind of thing. They massed their operations in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, with similar maneuvers, the same that they're doing right now. So I'm just objectively talking about the facts. So Doug is, from that point of view, sort of a realpolitik type of guy. It's what force dictates. He's not talking about ideology. Now, the issue he raises of the effect of it on the pipelines of Germany, and the fact of the Nord Stream 2 issue, which is a divisive issue in the European Union and NATO and the United States, that would be very interesting to see what happens. But what are the Republicans going to do if that happens? What are all these GOP guys who have been essentially kissing Putin's ass, how are they going to respond to this if something like that happens? I mean, it's a really tricky mess. And I noticed today that Trump basically, there are three and to Trump today, or Trump allies today, and Trump himself is now fighting to basically have all the cases dismissed against him, you know, with the whole January 6th thing. So,
Right.
you know,
I got one throw one one more animal into the cage here. How does this affect OPEC if Russia goes ahead and they push through and they get the Nord Stream line and they start delivering gas to Germany and the Netherlands? What does that do with OPEC? Because the gas prices are artificially high because Saudi Arabia is still holding back. I mean, that's really what's happening.
Well, that's a good question, Ken. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, what do other people think about that?
OPEC probably makes a lot more money, so OPEC will be happy if the price goes up.
Oh, because any kind of conflict drives up the price of oil.
You're talking about natural gas, not right.
Well,
Not
OPEC
crude,
sells natural gas
not
too.
crude.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia sells natural
Those countries
gas.
sell gas. I mean, the UAE and Qatar are major natural gas producers too. You know, so they.
So they're going to go
Well,
like,
the other-
you
well, the
guys
other
work it
thing-
out. Meantime, we got to charge more money.
Well, the other thing with MacGregor is he's on record. He goes on RT all the time. He's on record.
I told you he's a Russian apologist.
There you go.
And he
That's
goes
why
on.
Trump liked him.
Well, he's on record for basically favoring the annexation of the Donbass. So, and again, it's based on the fact that, you know, some people legitimately argue this. I mean, it's not like, you know, he's like some, right-wing oddball. I mean, he is a right-wing oddball, but, you know, some people argue this, like, you know, basically because most of the people in that area are Russian speaking, you know, they should basically be absorbed into Russia.
So let's invade. Just because they speak Russian, right? That's a kosher approach if you're Russian.
Dennis, what do you think about all this? I see you're finally unmuted. What do you think about all this issue with Russia, the Ukraine, all that stuff? What do you think?
Russia. You said it wrong, Jim.
Russia.
Come on, Dennis. We're with you. We're waiting for you.
Okay, now you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, the United States is the aggressor. They broke the treaty with Gorbachev. They promised they wouldn't move NATO one foot to the east, and they're trying to absorb the what do you call it again, the Eastern Bloc, which was Russia's, the Soviet Union. They're trying to absorb all of it. The United States is looking for, I don't know if they're looking for war, but they certainly are aggressive. And we should really be against the United States policy in all of this, because it's crazy. What we need is cooperation with Russia and China, and solving the world's problems is really what we need to do. We need to talk about global warming and the pandemic, and the global economic system and all that. And if we could get some people in power in the United States to want to cooperate with the rest of the world instead of dominate them, we go a long way towards solving the world's problems. Bye-bye. Hello? Hello?
All right. James, you wanted to...
We're here, Dennis. Don't worry. We heard you.
Yeah, this is a teaching that occurred a few days ago. This is Matthew Burrows. So this is a different group of opinion. Anatole Levin is part of the Quincy Institute. Doug was there. Cynthia Roberts. I know Cynthia. I actually offered Cynthia the first time she ever speak publicly on defense affairs back in the 70s. So that was you can see Cynthia's gone on to bigger and better things. And all these people. So they're talking about the situation in Ukraine. It should be interesting to listen to. And here's Doug talking last year, but this is most recent video of Doug talking. But anyway, I'm sure you have other stories to talk about, Alex.
Yeah, so we'll play this one last one, which is a bit of Mehdi Hassan had, I don't know if you guys have heard about this, these two scientists, Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi from Baylor University, who've invented and are giving away for free their new COVID vaccine that was developed in Texas. So again, here Mehdi Hassan has them on his MSNBC show. So this is interesting. Yeah. Full screen it. Oh, wait. Well, just a minute. I have to reload it. Wait, let's see. Oh, there we go.
Could we have prevented the rise of Omicron? Maybe kept those holiday gatherings with loved ones or those major travel plans we were hoping
Still
for.
not sharing it.
Developers
Gotta
of a new
Sorry. I didn't screen share. Dang it.
We're happy that you're watching it, but we want to watch it too.
Yeah.
Full screen with captions.
COVID-19 vaccine
and sound.
Moving to mass inoculate people around the world, say that's really all we needed. Mass vaccination. If we had even a fraction of the support that Moderna had, who knows? Maybe the world would be vaccinated by now. We wouldn't be having a discussion about Omicron. That was Dr. Peter Hotez of the Texas Children's Hospital's Center for Vaccine Development, who you've seen on this show many times. He and his longtime colleague, Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi, have created Corbavax, a new COVID vaccine that is a traditional protein vaccine, not mRNA, and it will be shared patent-free globally. The goal is to provide an affordable vaccine that can actually be manufactured by other countries to help communities fight COVID-19 much more quickly. India, a country that faced a catastrophic outbreak of the Delta variant last year and is already seeing a surge of Omicron cases as we speak, granted emergency approval to Corbavax last week. Licensed by the Baylor College of Medicine in Texas, it'll be manufactured by India's Hyderabad-based company Biological E. While Baylor College will get a fee, Drs. Hotez and Bottazzi won't be making any money from this vaccine. They've created it as a public service. It's the kind of story I wish we would have heard months ago from two of Big Pharma's most successful COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers, Pfizer and Moderna. But if you remember, despite resounding calls from world leaders to top scientists, doctors, humanitarians, activists to waive their patents so low-income countries could produce vaccines themselves, those two companies did not. Instead, President Biden, who eventually supported the patent waiver, offered to buy more Pfizer shots to share with the world.
The United States is buying another 500 million doses of Pfizer to donate to low and middle income countries around the world. And the United States is leading the world on vaccination donations. We need, as we're doing that, we need other high income countries to deliver on their own ambitious vaccine donations and pledges.
It was a very good gesture, but underserved countries weren't looking for charity during this global emergency. What they have asked for since the beginning was the ability to produce the vaccines themselves at the scale they needed. In fact, today, India is asking the World Trade Organization to hold an emergency meeting this month.
And upper middle income countries, while less than 1% of doses, less than 1%, have been given in low-income countries. And remember, this issue has never been about vaccinating the world just for the sake of being noble or kind or generous. We're in a global pandemic, and the only way we can go back to having big gatherings without worrying about them is if we stop new variants from threatening the progress we've made. That can only happen when we, the world over, are all vaccinated. Joining me now to discuss their new vaccine are Drs. Peter Hotez, he's the Dean for the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, and Maria Elena Bottazzi, who's the Associate Dean. Thank you both for coming on the show today. Happy New Year and congratulations on this achievement. Dr. Bottazzi, can I start with you? How did your team come to make this vaccine in what seems like a crowded global vaccine market where 137 vaccines, I believe, are in some stage of clinical development? How did Corbavax come about, and what does it offer that's different to the others?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be next to you and to Peter, which is a treat for me. Well, you know, very hard work by a few, but very dedicated scientists. We actually had almost 10 years of experience already working on coronavirus vaccine, originally SARS and then MERS. And I think that was instrumental for us to really react very quickly and create this prototype of the COVID-19 vaccine, which, as you mentioned, it's a recombinant protein technology, easy to make. And even though it's not, you know, super easy, but it's much easier than transferring the technology of an RNA or a adenovirus, which of course requires a lot of know-how, infrastructure, building new factories. Biological E had everything already ready to go, and that was, I think, a perfect partnership for us.
Dr. Hotez, you told the Washington Post that you're not trying to make any money here. You just want people to be vaccinated. We're more than a year into Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA vaccines being approved here in the U.S. How disappointed are you that your team received, I believe, no federal funding from Operation Warp Speed? Why do you think that's been the case? Has the Biden administration reached out to you at all?
Republicans are trying to disenfranchise millions of Americans from their right to vote. It's shameful.
Well, you know, the problem, Mehdi, was Operation Warp Speed, and it's mostly continued in this administration, is very focused on speed and innovation. They wanted to rapidly immunize the American people and wound up making some very interesting vaccines, the 2 mRNA vaccines and the adenovirus vectored vaccines. The problem with it was, like any new technology, there's a learning curve before you can go from 0 to 9 billion, which is what you need to vaccinate Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And there was never that situational awareness to say, hey, if you have a brand new technology, there's a learning curve. It'll take you a few years to figure out how to make enough doses beyond that needed for the United States, maybe North America and Western Europe. And we knew this was going to be a problem. So the frustration we had was, we said, look, we have a technology that's already in place in places like Indonesia and India and Bangladesh and parts of Latin America. Let's go with that technology, which you could rapidly scale to the billions of doses and could be made locally and rapidly vaccinate the Southern Hemisphere. We could just never get that buy-in. There was never that situational awareness or interest.
So, Dr. Bottazzi, India granted your vaccine an emergency approval last week, and its manufacturer there is based in Hyderabad, which I should point out is where my parents are from. Very proud Hyderabadi here. It's completed 2 phase 3 trials so far. It said that the vaccine is more than 80% effective against symptomatic disease. But the data seems to be limited, and there's none at all, is there, on how it deals with Omicron. Is that a concern?
No, well, you know, everybody's right now rushing to try to evaluate indeed how all the vaccines are going to perform against the Omicron. I think we are very optimistic because we've seen, as you noted, the greater than 80% efficacy that biologically demonstrated in the phase 3 was greater than, you know, for Delta and even Beta. And so we think that it's going to really hold really well. But of course, data and evidence will tell. You know, the company is really rushing to try to put together all the information submitted, of course, through the traditional peer review mechanisms. You know, we are all a small team, if you really think of it. So I think we owe them a little bit of patience after the complexity of this program, that they had to do multiple clinical trials. So we are very privileged that they are eventually going to share this with the scientific community, and we're very hopeful that it's also going to protect very well against Omicron.
Dr. Hotez, it's a major achievement what you've done with Dr. Bottazi and others. But at the end of the day, the mRNA vaccines are the ones that the Indian government, the South African government want to be able to produce, mass produce in their countries. You look at the proposal today to the WTO that India has resubmitted. What is going on there? Why has there not been a TRIPS waiver, a trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights waiver on these crucial mRNA vaccines? What would you say to Western governments, European governments that have not got behind a waiver yet, to even people like Bill Gates, who I believe has not got behind the waiver yet? Why have we not done this yet? And what will it take to get this done?
Well, there's a few aspects of this. First of all, whether or not the mRNA vaccines globally are going to have an impact on vaccinating the world, or whether our vaccine will come through and serve that purpose, remains to be seen. But the big question is, what about future pandemics? So I think what we've learned is we need to have as many different technologies in play as possible, as many shots on goal as you can get, because you never know which ones are really going to pan out. So having the mRNA technology locally is going to be as important as our technology, and be able to have equip developing country vaccine manufacturers, which is what they call themselves, the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. Which we need to provide them with all of the tools that they need to be successful, for the simple reason we've seen with the model that exclusively relies on the multinational companies, what we get is the Northern Hemisphere is vaccinated and the Southern Hemisphere is not. And this is why we have Omicron. This is why we had Delta, because we failed to vaccinate the global South.
All right, so that's obviously very interesting. Dennis, I think Dennis has left us temporarily, but Ken or Gail, what are your thoughts?
I believe that the kind of vaccine that Peter Hotez did with that lady whose name I've already forgotten.
Dr. Bottazi.
That sort of vaccine, I think, is not rocket science.
No.
From a generic perspective, but just because I kept reading STAT all those months, I guess I have some concept. I would never say I'm an expert, and this might be off, but I thought that it was no big whoop to do that kind of vaccine. The reason, everybody forgets this, and it's possible I'm wrong, but I don't think so. The reason everybody was jumping up and down for joy with the mRNA vaccines was not that it was harder to make, or that it was about a fancy copyright or patents. It was that it had much higher efficacy, for Christ's sake, like 90-something%. Theirs is 80%. That's a huge difference.
Right.
And it's a real interesting thing to argue
Gail, with Omicron,
backwards, the way everybody's arguing. Can I finish the sentence?
Yes, go ahead. I just
you muted everybody, Ken.
No, I'm just muting you. Oh, Gail, go ahead. Unmute yourself, Gail. Sorry. Unmute yourself. Gail, please unmute yourself.
I mean, my only point was that it seems like there's a bit of revisionist thinking when you, if I can get this right, that, it's all about the patent problems. I don't believe that's correct. I think it's about, let's get a vaccine that's really going to work. But if you listen, Jim and I this morning listened to the Senate debates about all of this, there's no consensus anyway. So I don't know. There's a lot of navel gazing going on all the way around.
You mean there's no consensus? There's no consensus about what kind of
about how to proceed with any perspective.
Right.
From any perspective. I mean, all of Donald Trump's faults, which are legion from here to the moon, at least somehow or other, he got a vaccine effort going despite his idiocy. I don't know how that happened. I mean, maybe it was just tangential to his big profile, but at
There doesn't
least we
seem to
got
be
going
world-
with the mRNA. It was exciting. It was new technology. And God bless the Germans because they had the technology, not us. It was a bio and tech company that developed the technology. For Christ's sake, everything isn't American. I'm so sick of hearing among these people here with us, everything isn't an American flaw.
Uh-huh.
You want to be mad about mRNA vaccines, you could blame the Germans. They're too good.
They did good. Okay, great. So the program you and Alex watched said there is an international consensus or there is an American consensus. Doctors, scientists, politicians, nobody's in control.
She's referring to the Senate hearings today that were held on this whole issue, and there was a big division in opinion about how to handle the COVID crisis. And the senior Republican on the committee was basically saying, "Oh my God, you guys didn't set up enough testing sites. Your policies failed." And then you had Fauci and all the big mucky mucks in the Biden administration dealing with the COVID crisis, basically responding to them. And it was back and forth all day. I think Rand Paul did another little attack on Fauci. They did a back and forth today, which made the news. But of course, the issue of how it's being exploited politically, that's what's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
Well, actually, I do want to say one thing. Dr. Hotez, who I see on MSNBC all the time, and this, I forgot her name, the woman who came up with this. The fact that they're just basically giving up the patent. They developed a vaccine that's relatively easier to make in individual countries. And it is 80%, if it has an efficacy, which is different from effectiveness, which is the difference between experimental and real world. But if it so far has an efficacy of 80%, that's actually better than the Russian or Chinese vaccines or Pfizer.
It's better than the Chinese vaccine, Mike. It's not better than the Russian. The Russian is 92%.
No, the Russian vaccine isn't 92%.
No, Mike, that's peer reviewed by the Lancet. I'm sorry.
Don't forget about AstraZeneca. You always forget about the Oxford contribution.
AstraZeneca, but the Russian vaccine is not 92%.
It's 92% by peer reviewed in the Lancet journal, Mike. You can't spread anti-vax.
Alex, nobody is going to tell you. Nobody can convince you of anything that is not pro-Russian.
That is not pro-Russian. This is in Western scientific journals. Not a Russian. This is not a Russian journal.
While they're
the Lancet, the most respected British medical journal anywhere.
Shut up, Alex. You can respond to me after I'm finished.
Yeah, everybody just got shut off. So let's go to let Michael finish what he was saying, then you can respond. Go ahead, Michael, unmute.
All right. Okay. Now, here's the thing. It's so far it has an efficacy, which is not effectiveness necessarily, but an efficacy that's better than most of the other vaccines, if not all the other vaccines that are not mRNA. 80% is not as good as 95%, but it's still pretty damn good. And if these countries can put it into effect, then this might be the most important step towards eliminating towards ending this pandemic that has been done so far. Simply because this will be the most important step towards getting the entire world vaccinated.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Not true.
So Gail, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I would have to go back and read 6 months of stat. Everybody can read it on the internet. It's pretty authoritative on all this stuff. I think there's maybe Alex remembers because he's the youngest of us. He has a memory, better memory anyway. Maybe there is already, I think, some kind of Indian vaccine. India has big pharma of its own version, right? So come on, stop just thinking about America as everything. This is really a problem here.
Okay, great.
Sinovac is the big bomb, if I'm remembering correctly. The Chinese version is the one that doesn't work too well, which is maybe why we're having so many problems anyway, given their breadth of their population and the spread from, assuming the whole thing started in China. Anyway, it seems, I don't know, we're off and running. So it's too bad that the Sinovac thing wasn't as effective, if I'm remembering correctly.
Okay, let me put in a parting word here. Nobody's brought this up, that the head of the CDC said of the people who died from Omicron in the US, I assume, 75% had 4 or more comorbidities. Of 75% of the people who died from the Omicron version of COVID-19, 75% of them had 4 or more comorbidities. So, chill out. And the deaths are still low. Everybody's getting it. Let's see what happens. Just remember, it's less than 1%. And it's mostly 80% people over 65 and 75, like us. So soon I'm going to see everybody on the other side. We're all going to have a big adventure, move on, and we'll pass away.
I'm glad you're volunteering. I'm glad you're volunteering.
You don't have to volunteer. Don't worry.
No, you can volunteer to go to the other side first.
You can. Don't worry.
Let us know what it's like over there.
Yeah, I'll be there. I'll make.
Alex will become the spokesman.
I'll be there to serve you hors d'oeuvres when you arrive.
Yeah.
Okay, close, Jim.
Okay, so you've been listening to the January 11th version of Going Viral at goingviral.news. My name is Jim Dingeman. We've been joined in California with Ken Aaron. We've had Dennis Goldstein in New Jersey, Mike Jankowitz in Queens, Gail, Aronow, and Alex Stavropoulos in the Isle of Manhattan, and myself up in the Bronx. You've been listening to Going Viral at goingviral.news. Good night and stay tuned.